Hey there, welcome back in our AZ-801 course, Configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. This specific module covers migrate servers and workloads in on-prem and hybrid environments. If you've been through our previous modules, you already know the guidelines we have. The first module in the topic always touches on the on-prem aspect or the Windows Server specific aspect of the technology. And then the second follow-up module is covering the same concept, but looking at it from an Azure perspective. And it's no different for this module, where the first module touched on migrating Windows Server workloads in a couple of different scenarios, where now we're going to touch on what it looks like from a hybrid scenario, which means migrating on-prem Windows servers, and I could say not just on-prem, but hybrid, running in different cloud environments, and now bringing them into an Azure virtual machine instance. Second section I'll cover here is a little bit like I already run my Azure virtual machines. What about upgrading the workloads, or maybe how to migrate from one Azure virtual machine into another? And then last, stepping a little bit away from the virtual machine architecture, where I'm going to talk a bit about migrating your workloads, specifically web workloads using ASP.NET, and how to migrate them from a virtual machine which could run on-prem, hybrid, or already in Azure virtual machine, and how to move them into an Azure app service. So again, I hope you're going to enjoy learning new things as much as I enjoy presenting, and I would say let's jump right in. Where this first section is migrating workloads, hybrid / on-prem Windows Server instances into an Azure virtual machine. So in short, we're going to position an Azure service called Azure Migrate. It's one of those most obvious terminologies, I guess, in the platform, because it's all about helping you migrating workloads into Azure. But before jumping into the actual technology, we're going to talk a little bit about how to properly plan your migration. Thanks to Azure Migrate, it's actually becoming quite easy because it has an assessment aspect, which to me is always one of the key components in running your actual migration. Like a lot of the success of the migration is because of doing a proper assessment. Once you know what you're running, once you know what you can and maybe cannot migrate, that's where the actual migration becomes quite easy. And as you can see here, we got a few demos, as always, in our other modules. Already had quite a lot of them, and it's no different for this one. Now, what does it mean to plan your migration? Again, you might have so many different workloads, might be Windows Server, might be totally different platforms. Some of it might be in your control, and obviously a whole bunch of other workloads might not even be 100% in your control. Next to that, when we think about migration, there's a lot of different migration strategies. We talk about rehosting. This is probably the one I'm talking about most here. What it means is you already have your workload, it's 100% supported to move into an Azure virtual machine, and it's what some describe as a lift and shift migration. But you could also have a refactoring. What we're doing here is making minimal changes to an application, but we're not moving it from a virtual machine state into another virtual machine state. So thinking of what I'll talk about a little bit more towards the end of the module is an existing application web workload with a supported application version is now getting moved into a container, maybe getting moved into app services. Another scenario is re-architecting. What we're doing here is dramatically changing the architecture of the platform, like really rebuilding your environment, where you're going to move into, for example, migrating away from monolith applications into a microservice, into containerized scenarios, where a lot of the application is now getting changed, and that's where you need a new architecture. And then the last option you have in any migration scenario is completely rebuilding your app from scratch, which could mean we're running like a legacy .NET application on top of a Windows Server platform, and now we're going to move into an application state with Azure Functions, with Logic Apps, and maybe not even using the .NET framework anymore. So a lot of different options. What we're going to focus on in this section and in this module is migrating virtual machine workloads. Now you can see here, this is an easy listing of what is Azure Migrate offering as a possible migration capability. I'm going to zoom in on how to use it to migrate from an existing virtual machine workload running on Windows into an Azure virtual machine, almost like a lift and shift migration from on-prem or hybrid, because it also supports AWS, Google Cloud, and maybe even physical servers to be picked up and moved into an Azure virtual machine. But as you know from the previous slide, that's not the only option we have in that migration topic. So that's where Azure Migrate can help you in server assessment and server migration. But if you don't want to migrate or you don't need to migrate from a VM into a new VM in Azure, you can also migrate to an Azure SQL hosted scenario, just migrating the database and then obviously doing the same for web apps. And I got a demo on that later on. And then last, we also have Azure Migrate, where we touch on Databox, and that's basically an offline migration scenario, where it allows you basically to copy your data from your on-prem environment into offline Databox equipment, which could be protected, encrypted, ruggedized physical disk, all the way to a big chassis, like literally a server case, which gets offloaded into your closest by Azure region, and then someone within the data center will offload your data. I'm not going to talk too much about Databox because, again, it's a specific scenario and it's quite complex to show in a demo because I don't get access to Databox, but I can show you quite a lot of that server migration aspect. So the key message here is rely on Azure Migrate. So in short, what is Azure Migrate? It's a built-in resource in the platform. You need to enable it. You need to deploy the Azure Migrate service. And from there, you create one or more migration projects, where a migration project is just a placeholder where it allows you to define what kind of workload am I running and what is my migration path looking like. As already mentioned before, you can migrate a lot of different scenarios, like traditional Windows Server, I think is still one of the more popular ones, that lift and shift server migration, but it also works for SQL out of a virtual machine into SQL Azure, using the same for Linux virtual machine workloads. And then we also highlight ASP.NET, PHP, and Java applications, which are also supported. And then two other highlights is SAP HANA, like the SAP database environment, can also be migrated, and migrating from on-prem to Azure running specialized compute is also an option. So a lot of different use cases, and it's actually quite interesting. A couple of screenshots here. So the starting point is performing that assessment. I told you at the introduction part of the module, if you're in this migration phase, spend as much time as possible on that assessment. What it means is the more information you can capture from your existing runtime environment, the more accurate you can decide what is my future environment looking like. Can we migrate virtual machines? Do we need to migrate to virtual machines? Do we have that capacity available in Azure? Is it a supported operating system? And so many more questions that make a migration basically quite complex are now simplified thanks to that server assessment task. So the way it works is you deploy that server Azure Migrate backend. From there, you're going to run the assessment, and it's going to ask you like, hey, what kind of assessment do you want to run? And then you typically going to deploy what we call a migration assessment appliance. Depending on your source environment, if it's Hyper-V, it's obviously supported. If you have VMware with vCenter, that's important. It's also supported. And you're going to deploy this virtual machine appliance, like just introducing Azure Migrate appliance into your already existing environment. And from there, you're going to define your assessment characteristics, where it needs access to obviously local admin accounts to gather all that information from your machines. It needs preferably network communication access to those servers. And that's where if you have Hyper-V Manager or you have VMware vCenter, instead of connecting to all your endpoints, it's gathering information from that centralized database. On top of that, the other recommendation I have in creating that assessment is keep it running for, again, as long as possible. The more information you can capture out of that assessment appliance, the more accurate information you get. Because imagine that you're going to run it for just a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days. it might not really get a clear view on what is the actual average CPU load, memory load that we have in our source server. If you have workloads where the behavior is changing a little bit based on the time of day, maybe based on seasonality, it could even be a scenario where you're going to run this assessment for not just a couple of days, but maybe weeks, maybe spreading over a couple of months. And that's also what I did in the field, like deploying the assessment part of it and then telling the customer like, well, I'm going to come back in a couple of months from now when we have this detailed database. But at the same time, you could also rely on other inventory mechanisms. So if you have, like, I don't know, System Center Configuration Manager, which is the counterpart to get a database of like, this is what we're running, you could also feed all that information into that assessment exercise. A lot of different options. I would say that's the main message. From there, once you have your assessment done, it's going to highlight what is supported, what not, and also pretty cool, defining suggestions like, hey, you're running a web server inside a VM. You could still migrate to an Azure VM as a web server, like that lift and shift approach, right? But maybe it's already detecting that it can run fully supported in an Azure App Service, which means you don't need the virtual machine anymore. Same thing for SQL Server databases, where it could recommend you, and again, it's just an offering, it's a suggestion, you don't have to follow those guidelines. But I think it's pretty cool that it's not just limiting itself to VM migration, but also allowing you to migrate to other kinds of cloud scenarios. So basically 2 different steps. You deploy Azure Migrate, you run the assessment, and then from there, you decide what kind of migration approach, migration strategy you want to use. So with that, I'm going to jump to my demo environment, and I'm going to show you how to get started with Azure Migrate, looking at my source environment, running some sort of an assessment, and then from there picking one virtual machine and showing you how easy it is to migrate. So the starting point in our server migration with Azure is using Azure Migrate. So just like any other Azure resource, you start with deploying Azure Migrate as the resource, and then from there you have a few different options. So depending on your scenario, you would loop through any of these migration goals. So again, in short, servers, databases, web apps, it allows you to migrate virtual machines, Windows, Linux from on-prem, physical, hybrid VMware, or Hyper-V into Azure virtual machines. You can also migrate specific web apps or migrating SQL, and then again, Databox is that offline data migration. Next, we select servers, databases, and web apps, where the first time if you run this, it's going to ask you to create a project. So the idea behind the project is creating a logical unit of servers you want to assess together with running the actual replication and then migrating your server. Once you have your project defined, it's going to open up assessment tools and you're going to run a discovery. Out of the discovery, it's where it's going to ask you to deploy an on-prem server. So you need to deploy a virtual machine appliance. Let's see if I can still show you what that looks like. So when you go for using the appliance, it's going to ask you what kind of virtualization do you have. It's Hyper-V, and it's going to ask you to generate a key that's getting created in here. And then you're going to download that key to your on-prem environment. And next, you need to deploy or download the Azure Migrate appliance. So you can choose copying the VHD file or running a PowerShell zip install from the local machine. Once you've downloaded all the assets, you're going to set up the appliance, and I'll show you screen information about that in a second. And then from there, running the appliance configuration, running the discovery, and after that, your machine will show up. So switching back to my on-prem Hyper-V server, I deployed the appliance. It's running inside Hyper-V, and then from there, it allows you to connect using the browser. So the first time, it's going to walk you through a couple of different steps. Obviously, in my environment, I already went through all this to not make the demo too long. but it could become a sort of lengthy process depending on the complexity of your environment. So a couple of things that I want to highlight. The appliance server needs connectivity to Azure because it's really acting as that gateway from on-prem to the project and then sending discovered virtual machine information into the Azure environment. It's going to check for some updates where I don't have any real experience. If it's really installing updates, I guess if you download the latest version, from the portal, you're probably going to have the latest one. It's going to ask you for the project key. So that's what you define here, running some updates. And then it's going to ask you for your Azure admin credentials. Where important, I would say check the required permissions because it's interacting with RBAC. Once all this is done, it's going to ask you for local Hyper-V credentials. So there's a few different options here. You can manually add your credentials. So I got 2 different admin accounts. I'm using the local account, but if you have them domain joined, you could also use domain credentials. Once all that is done, we're going to define the Hyper-V host information. And from there, what is the source type? What is the IP address? Pretty obvious. And from here, you're going to run a discovery. Now, this is an interesting option here. So the guest discovery enabled means that Azure is going to try and help you, or at least the migration part of it is going to try and help you in identifying what am I running on the server? And based on that, what kind of migration path would I recommend? So it's going to look into SQL Server, it's going to look into web servers, and Java, Tomcat, or .NET are the supported ones from now. You keep this running for, I would say, as long as needed, where in my environment, I only have 2 source VMs, so it's not going to take a huge amount of time. And to make sure that it can reach those source servers, it's again going to ask you to define local credentials. So the first credential is connecting to the Hyper-V hosts. The second credential is connecting to the actual guest virtual machines, where I'm using Windows local admin, could be domain admins, could be Linux accounts. So it all depends on your environment. And then from there, you allow it to run the discovery. Once the discovery is done, we can go back to our Azure Migrate scenario. And you can see here that now it's listing up 2 discovered servers. One of them is a web server. They belong to the same group, and you have X amount of appliances. So all those status reporting is there. So you might have 2 already configured, but 1 is registered, and that means you still have some action for a second appliance. So that's the cool thing as well in your migration, that you don't have to deploy one single appliance to migrate everything. You can really create migration groups. If you run an assessment, it's going to show you or allowing you to configure some target information. What is my source and target? It's Azure Virtual Machine as the target. Servers discovered using Azure Migrate. What is the target location? What about the savings, like a 3-year reserved instance, assuming that's what you want to go for, and then also include security costs. What it's going to do from here, based on your source environment, it's going to look into your server settings, it's going to look into the operating system, and then allowing you to run an assessment. And that's going to give you an overview of virtual machine size, recommended size in Azure, the cost aspect for the runtime VM, as well as the storage, and then obviously the Windows license as well. Once all this is done, we can move over to actual migration. So here it's again using my 2 discovered servers, and it's sometimes a bit confusing because servers here means the actual Hyper-V hosts. Well, now we're going to run a replicate state, and it's going to ask you again, hey, what do you want as the target? I want to migrate my servers, or if you only want to migrate web apps from a VM into Azure App Services, that could also be an option here. Where do you want to migrate to? So in my case, it's on-prem VM into Azure VM, or you could also move into Azure Local. And then obviously, is the machine source virtualized or is it physical hybrid? That's the next question here. Once all this is done, obviously it's going to take a while to get all your servers replicated into Azure. And that's to me where the beauty of the solution comes in, because not that long ago in the same course, we talked about the protection of on-prem servers using Azure Site Recovery. And this is really where now, after the migration planning phase, the assessment phase is done. Once you do replicate and migrate, it's basically using Azure Site Recovery. So I'm not going to repeat everything what Site Recovery is going to give you. If you are just jumping into this Migrate module and it's the first time you hear about Site Recovery, I could recommend you to go back to our course module 4, where we talk about Hyper-V failovers, Windows failover clustering, and then one of them is also protecting on-prem Windows Server. But you can imagine from here, my migration is still running, but what we would do is selecting a failover, and that's where we're technically running a migration. Once the failover is done, you're going to commit the changes and then eventually complete the migration, which means there is nothing left for me in the on-prem environment. It's a disaster recovery scenario out of Azure Site Recovery that we now turned into a migration path using Azure Migrate. So with that, I would say let's go back to the presentation. Good. Now, there was one little thing that I didn't mention, right? And that's where the actual migration, to move my virtual machine from on-prem to Azure, is technically relying on Azure Site Recovery. If you missed the 2 modules we have on Azure Site Recovery, where we initially positioned it out of disaster recovery, then I would say maybe go back to those ones. But in the end, what we're doing with a VM migration is almost identical to that disaster recovery. We're just not failing back to on-prem. So that's pretty much it. Now, next to that, there's obviously another migration or upgrade path possible. And that's where you're not migrating from non-Azure virtual machine environments into Azure VMs, but you already run Azure virtual machines. And that's what this next section will cover: how to upgrade or migrate your already workloads running in Azure. The first option here is in-place upgrades. What we're doing is you're running Azure virtual machines like Windows Server 16, 19, and you want to move to the later version, preferably Server 2025. So for quite some time, Windows servers are actually pretty good in performing in-place upgrades. You keep the server as is, you're going to move to the latest version, and that's pretty much it. Now, keep in mind there's still some downtime, because obviously it needs to update all the operating system components. Second option to migrate or upgrade the workload is just deploying a new environment. You have your existing workloads, you deploy new, fresh Windows Server 2025s preferably, and you're going to migrate the workloads, which could be migrating the data, which could be reinstalling applications and copying the data. If you think back about one of our modules about high availability, about clustering, it's also allowing you to migrate in a mixed operating system version environment. And for example, migrating from like a SQL 2016 all the way to SQL 2022 or later using that exact same approach. Another scenario that we want to touch on here is migrating to new hardware. Obviously not really in scope for like migrating to Azure, but if you have this traditional data center, obviously maybe part of your migration could also involve migrating new hardware. Like if you run Hyper-V in outdated physical hardware, then maybe one of the migrations you need to face is migrating the same Hyper-V setups into new physical hardware. And that's where, again, that last option, the clustering, what we call rolling upgrades, could also be beneficial. What you're doing here is introducing new operating system version into an existing cluster, and then from there migrating the workloads. A lot of different options. This can all run in a hybrid scenario, this could also run obviously within 100% Azure environment. And then the other option here is back to storage migration service. Now, I mentioned back to storage migration service, but that's an assumption that you already were here in the previous module, where we positioned storage migration service out of that Windows Admin Center to migrate your on-prem workloads into that file system or storage migration aspect. Now, no secrets there. It is relying a little bit on an Azure service in the backend, like the Azure Storage Migration Service, and that's why we bring it in again here. Which means that if you already run Azure virtual machines and you want to migrate to a new version of the operating system and the server role is a file server, you could obviously use the exact same practice from within Azure to other Azure virtual machines. I'm not going to repeat everything else from storage migration service. There's a few other topics that I touched on, but that's where I would refer to the previous module. And then the last section here is migrating away or migrating my workloads away from a virtual machine into a different architecture, where we like to position two different scenarios, containerizing and migrating ASP.NET web applications. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, we go back to Azure Migrate that we already talked about in the first section of the module, but this time we're not migrating from a VM into another VM. What we're going to do here is migrating an existing web application server using ASP.NET, but the workload scenario also supports PHP and Java, just a little bit, I would say, off topic for my demo scenario, which will be ASP.NET based. And then obviously a big part is showing you how it works. So you're going to use Azure Migrate, everything we already talked about, where now the target environment is no longer an Azure VM, but we're going to decide that we want to migrate our existing virtual machine web workload into a containerized scenario. Now, running containers, that's a little bit what this diagram is representing. You could run containers in Azure in a lot of different ways. Bit off topic for the module of AZ-801. We're not expecting you to all of a sudden become like container experts, but you could run containers in Azure using container instance, like bring my Docker container, we're going to run it. You could move into an Azure Kubernetes service like that high-end Kubernetes orchestration-based scenario, or you could move into an Azure Container Apps scenario where the backend is basically still Kubernetes, but you're no longer facing the complexity, I would say, of what a Kubernetes environment could look like. And then last, you also have traditional app services in Azure, and they also provide support for containers. What I'm going to show you here is how to go back to Azure Migrate, creating a project, running the assessment, and then from there showing you how to migrate your existing web workload into a containerized scenario. And then obviously showing you what it looks like running that container in Azure. So in the previous demo scenario, I showed you how you could use Azure Migrate to migrate your on-prem or hybrid running virtual machines, where this example is going to show you what it takes to use the same Azure Migrate approach, but this time picking up just the application workload and moving it into app containers. Knowing that it doesn't need to be containers, you can use the same approach to migrate from a web server, application server into Azure App Service. So my starting point here is a web application. It's like a little retail application sample that I picked up from our .NET product team, just to show you that I actually do have a workload up and running. Next to that, I went to the app migrate web page and downloading the app containerization tool. So that's mainly what you see over here. You download the tool, it's a PowerShell script, and from there you would run it inside the server. So I can pull it up here. There we go. And it's pretty straightforward. So you download the tool, you're going to run it. It's going to validate PowerShell, validate the operating system, checking obviously if it is indeed a web server, and then downloading the actual Azure Migrate container tool. Once this is complete, you can open up your migration page through the browser. And as you can see, all the steps are complete. I just wanted to show you the different cycles you have to go through. I need to apologize for the going up and down a bit, but it's not allowing me to show the full flow. So I need to close the tabs and then jumping up and down. So it's going to ask me what kind of application type. So it's or ASP.NET or it's Tomcat Java. And then obviously the target in this case is Azure App Service running containers. You could also select containers in a Kubernetes environment. It's going to validate some prerequisites. So you need to agree the license. If the server cannot directly connect to the internet, you need to enable the proxy. It's going to install the web deploy if for as far it's not installed yet. And you need to enable PowerShell remoting. Once you do continue, it's going to ask you for your Azure admin credentials, and you're going to select your target tenant and subscription. From there, it's going to look into your local server. So I defined the IP address, and it's going to validate some configuration, and it's recognizing I'm running IaaS with a default website. From there, and that's where for me it really becomes powerful because it knows the subscription. So it's going to ask you like, hey, what kind of Azure target container registry do you want, which is the storage location for Docker containers. And you can select to create a new one or pick one that you already have. And then last, it's going to look into the server and start creating the container for you. The way to do that is a Docker file where it's a text file, and it's going to allow you to bring in your own customizations. It's not showing it here anymore because my compile was already complete. But if you're not building it yet, it's going to show you the Docker file syntax and actually allowing you to make changes to it. From there, you select build, and this could take a while. So that's why I also wanted to speed up the demo a little bit. And then once the Docker container is compiled, it's going to allow you to deploy to the Azure environment. So you can define the app service plan, what kind of file share you want to use because it's all PowerShell based, and then obviously which container you want to migrate. And then all the way at the end, it's showing you, I'm going to create a web page inside Azure App Services, and then it's deploying to Azure. With all this out of the way, let me close my virtual machine, opening up the application. So I got an Azure App Service. Once I connect to that site, you can see that over here, this is the site that I have running a little Docker container, and my application got migrated. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. I know this took like 4 minutes in the demo sequence, but in totality, it's probably like 15, 20 minutes because the container creation stage is again taking quite some time. But super convenient, super easy. And then obviously you also have the integration with Azure Migrate. But nothing's really different from the previous part where now you would select Migrate Web Apps. You would run the assessment, so looking into your local scenario, and then running the actual migration where it's going to tell you here to download the necessary tools. So from there, once you download the tool, I showed you the direct approach, but you could interact with your Azure Migrate project as well. So that's all what I wanted to show you and talk about at this part of the demo. So let's switch back to the presentation. Well, that was pretty nice. I'm super excited that my full migration scenario worked, where all the way at the start of the module, I showed you how to migrate virtual machines from an on-prem hybrid scenario into Azure virtual machines. We talked about how to upgrade, how to migrate specific workloads already running in Azure to different machines, still running in Azure. And then the last topic, how to migrate your web application workloads a little bit away from virtual machine architecture, but moving them into containers, and all that using the same Azure Migrate. So that we're at the end of this module, where again, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're still learning as much as I enjoy sharing knowledge with all of you. And we're getting closer to the end of the course, where I got one more topic to cover. It's going to be 2 different modules. and it's all about monitoring and troubleshooting. So with that, thanks for being here, and would like to invite you to join me for those last 2 modules. Thank you for now, and I'll see you again soon.